Hi everyone. So welcome to this week's quick review, week two. So my hope is that I can do a quick review of some of the things that we're studying each week, um, and I hope to do it every week. You never know what happens, but that's the goal. So with that in mind, it was kind of a different week this week, and we engaged in some what I thought were fun and great activities to talk about the different colonies. It can be a dry, boring topic, so I wanted to do something fun to liven it up a little bit. With that in mind, you know that each group was assigned a different colony to present, and you might know your colony really well, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations that the other groups did, but you might be just a little shaky about some of the other colonies. So I'm going to quickly go over some of the colonies, some of the highlights, some of the things that are really important about each colony. And I certainly want to encourage you, this is not a substitute for reading or the notes, but just a little extra. So with that in mind, let's talk about New England. New England is, needless to say, a particularly important colony. We already spent some time on New England. When we talk about New England, we've already mentioned William Bradford and John Winthrop's City on the Hill, Miles Standish and his leadership in the New England colony. Some mnemonic devices that help us with New England. Rocks and religion describe the culture and the geography. Cod and God describes the economy of fishing. It's implied that they're involved in shipbuilding. And of course, again, the focus on religion. Small subsistent farming was the main economic issue. When we talk about the social aspect of New England, it's a culture that's dominated by men. Religious intolerance, religious freedom is often mentioned, and of course they really weren't interested in religious freedom. They were interested in religious freedom for themselves, but not others. And the treatment of Native Americans, as we will talk about later, specifically the Pequot War. So New England is a very important colony. I feel like we had an opportunity to talk about it last week, but certainly they deserve to be mentioned when we rattle off the colonies. Virginia is very similar. We talked about Jamestown and Virginia. I'd like to talk about the development of Virginia after Jamestown. And Nathaniel Bacon, John Smith, John Rolfe, Pocahontas we talked about. But Nathaniel Bacon is particularly important. And Nathaniel Bacon, and specifically Bacon's Rebellion, illustrates a number of important things that were going on in Virginia. One was a class difference between people who lived on the coast, oftentimes referred to as tidewater, and people who lived inland a little bit, often referred to as the back country. So people in the tidewater had more money, they had more political power, they had more resources, and people who lived in the back country were less politically influential and had less power, less money, etc. And what was happening was Bacon was one of those backcountry people who was very upset about, as he saw, the lack of support that the governor, a guy by the name of Berkeley, was giving to these backcountry farmers. Native American uprisings, things of that nature. Bacon wanted Berkeley to send in the military, and Berkeley wouldn't do it. There are a number of economic reasons why he wouldn't. He wanted to have a monopoly on some of the fur trade with Native Americans. Berkeley did. But Bacon organized an army and attacked the Native Americans himself, and then turned on Jamestown, eventually burning Jamestown down and forcing Berkeley to run away. Berkeley is literally on the boat fleeing Jamestown when Bacon dies of dysentery. This was a period where people died often for any number of reasons. Berkeley is able to come back to Jamestown with Bacon's rebellion in disarray and establish control. Now that's like the what it is. That's what happened. The why it's important is a number of things. It illustrates the class conflict that was happening between free indentured servants, landless white people, and the rich aristocracy of Jamestown. And that conflict and that difficulty to labor supply to control, and this fear of uprising is going to lead them to gravitate towards slaves. And when we talk about mnemonic devices, when we talk about Jamestown, we sometimes say slaves and sodweed, in other words, tobacco. So slavery in many ways is an offshoot of Bacon's rebellion, and it's really kind of an important thing to understand. Some of this is easy and simple, so I'm not going to spend time on it. Tobacco plantations, indentured servants, we spent a lot of time in class. The head right system was a system of encouraging people to come to Virginia by granting land. Indentured servants, after their stint, would get 50 acres. Oftentimes, the people who brought them to America would also get land. Oftentimes, indentured servants wouldn't survive their contract, and the plantation owners would amass huge estates. We talked a little bit about class struggle, slavery. We'll talk more about, and again, we talked quite a bit in class about women and widowarchy. This idea that there were a lot of people dying, and remarriage was exceedingly common, and women having a little bit more of a social mobility in Jamestown as opposed to other places. Again, the House of Burgesses, Joint Stock Company, and Starving Time, I think, was gone over quite a bit in class, so I'm just going to clip through. My goal is to get done in 10 minutes, and I don't know if that's going to happen. Maryland. Maryland is an interesting colony because it was a colony that was first established for Catholics. You know, in England, there's the Protestant Revolution going on. There's a lot of uncertainty if you're a Catholic about how you're going to be treated in England. And Cecil Calvert, who will later be referred to as Lord Baltimore, finds Maryland based on providing a haven for Catholics. The Maryland Act of Toleration was the first law that protected freedom of religion to a degree. It protected Christianity, but you could be Catholic, you could be Quaker, you could be Protestant, you could be Calvinist, you could be anything as long as it was Christian in Maryland. Now, that is later going to change. It's interesting what happens in Maryland. Maryland, you know, it also makes me laugh. They name their colony Maryland, and they're really kissing up to the Queen here, right? So they go to America, they're really looking for religious freedom, and they say, well, you know, let's name it after Queen Mary, Maryland. But I got off topic a little bit. What happens in Maryland is that Protestants greatly outnumber Catholics, although it was started as a Catholic haven. And over time, there becomes tremendous discord in Maryland. And it's interesting because Maryland is the only colony originally, or the first, that allows religious freedom to this degree. And it's a colony that ends up having a lot of strife over religion. And a lot of Catholics are later killed. Later, the Maryland Act of Toleration is repealed. Protestants take over the government. So it's interesting to kind of see how that unfolded in Maryland. Rhode Island. My favorite thing about Rhode Island is that it was called, and in a nasty way, they would call it Rogues Island. Rogues, you know. So these people go to Rhode Island who are rogues. These are the people who are on the fringe of acceptable society. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are the founders of, or Roger Williams is the founder of Rhode Island, and Anne Hutchinson is one of the more popular and important people who went there. Anne Hutchinson is exceedingly important in American history, in my opinion, because she represents the women's rights movement in colonial America, and she's a woman who starts preaching in her house. This is frowned upon, to say the least, in Puritan society. She's dragged in front of the ministers to defend herself, and famously, she was a brilliant debater. So, and she understood the Bible to a degree that very few people could. So here she is talking to these theologians, these people who are considered to be experts in the Bible, and she's just embarrassing them with her debate skills and her knowledge of the Bible. She's exiled, she's forced to leave. She believes in some pretty radical things. She believes that God has spoken directly to her. The idea is, who is she to think that, you know? She teaches something that later becomes known as antinomianism, which means she's literally going against the law. She doesn't believe that you have to go to church. She really takes Calvinism to its logical conclusion, that if God has predestined people, then you don't have to go to church to be going to heaven. God's already decided. You don't have to listen to what the preachers say. God has already decided. You have heaven within you, so to speak. So she says some very radical things in that she's a woman, and the impact that this has on women. The Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony start to restrict rights of women even to a greater degree. And there's a lot of women's historians, when we look at women's history, that look to Anne Hutchinson as, for lack of a better word, I don't know if this is the best word, but one of America's first feminists, and certainly one of the most important women in early America. Rhode Island has a very similar New England economy: fishing, trade, small farms. It's very liberal, Rhode Island, Rogues Island. The people who were considered to be the most liberal would go to Rhode Island. I find that fascinating because today Rhode Island is a very liberal place, and there's certain sections of Rhode Island that are known for its liberal ideas. Jefferson uses Rhode Island as a model in terms of separation of church and state. You know, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are coming from Massachusetts Bay Colony, in which religion and the state are intimately connected. They created a colony in which there's a strict separation of church and state. When Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence and the role that he played on the Constitution, he certainly referenced Roger Williams. This last one, sewer, sometimes kids see the note and they don't know what I'm talking about. Other colonies oftentimes refer to Rhode Island or Rogues Island as a sewer because they saw it as so extreme. All right, Connecticut. Connecticut, south of Massachusetts Bay, about 100 miles away from Boston, is going to be a colony where they break away from Massachusetts Bay, primarily because they think that the religious intolerance of Massachusetts Bay is too strict and unyielding. So they're more interested in economic than religion originally, especially people in Hartford. But there's a little bit of a divide in Connecticut, which can be confusing to kids. So Thomas Hooker and Hartford broke away from Massachusetts Bay Colony because they thought religion was too strict. John Davenport and New Haven actually are more strict. And we see the first blue laws in America, and they still have these today. You know, there's certain places where you can't buy alcohol on Sunday. That would be referred to as a blue law, and that originated in Connecticut. By far, the most important thing about Connecticut, colonial Connecticut anyway, is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's the first written constitution. And I sometimes say, you know, like copying someone's homework, which I hope you're not doing, but like copying someone's homework, when other colonies went to write a constitution, listen, what would you do if you had to write a constitution? You might go look at what someone else wrote. So the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the first written constitution in America, becomes a model for almost all other constitutions. All right, I'm looking at the clock here. I'm trying to go fast. The Carolinas, North and South Carolina. The most important part of North and South Carolina is how they differ from each other. North Carolina is more interested in small, subsistent farming. South Carolina is more like a Virginia, large plantations. And what's fascinating about South Carolina is that it's going to become the colony with the greatest percentage of slaves. And South Carolina, with that in mind, South Carolina is going to have a long history of being one of the most ardent supporter of slavery. South Carolina later will be the first state to secede. South Carolina is the home of some really important people like John C. Calhoun, who is a proponent of states' rights. So South Carolina, when we look at South Carolina today, and in the 1950s and 60s especially, guys like Strom Thurmond, who we'll learn about, and segregation, South Carolina is going to have a long history and not such a great history regarding slaves and later African Americans. New York, what you need to know about New York is that it has always been a culturally diverse place. I find this so fascinating just because where we live, it was originally settled by the Dutch. We see that. Blauvelt is a Dutch name. Piermont's a Dutch name. Anything that ends in a kill. Kill is river for Dutch, in Dutch. So Catskill is a Dutch name. New Amsterdam was the original name of New York. And I like how when the English took it over, they like put their stamp on it. We're no longer New Amsterdam, we're New York. I'm about to run out of time. I'm going to keep it at 15 minutes. So at this point, I'm going to say goodbye. You can get the